Welcome to the mysterious casebook where every whisper hides a clue. Tonight we journey with Miss Marple into ash, falling on Gossington Green, a village steeped in silence and secrets. Light a candle and let the mystery begin. The morning light over Gossington Green had the faint, filtered calm of a church window, soft, deliberate, and a little too still. There was no wind to move the yellowing elms, and the frost that had settled in the grass looked like the residue of a vanished bonfire, pale as ash. The village, half wrapped in the gentleness of its own routine, moved in miniature milk bottles clinking at doorsteps, a cat pawing at Mrs. Price Ridley's geranium pots, and the faint whistle of the postman, who was always a bar off key. It was the kind of morning Miss Marple liked best for small observations. From her sitting-room window she could see almost the entire triangle of Gossington Green Vicarage Lane at one end, the stone path leading to Mrs. Bantry's garden at the other, and between them the gentle slope of the green itself, where the ash trees leaned like modest old gentlemen bowing to the years. She had her knitting in hand, of course, but it had been a long time since she'd looked at her needles. Her eyes were fixed on a curious movement near the duck pond. A mano, a boy, really, though his back was stooped and his coat too large was bending down among the reeds. He appeared to be searching for something. Each time he lifted his head, he looked around as if afraid of being seen. Miss Marple noted with mild surprise that it was young Peter Simmons, the under-gardener from Gossington Hall. The Simmons boy wasn't known for early rising. At the same moment, Mrs. Bantry's housekeeper, old Mrs. Lorimer, appeared at the edge of the garden path, calling out with the authority of long service. "Peter, what on earth are you doing out there? You'll catch your death before luncheon." Peter started, almost dropping what looked like a handkerchief into the mud. Then, hastily pocketing it, he rose and stammered something about a duck caught in the reeds. Mrs. Lorimer didn't seem convinced, but, with a scowl that could prune roses, waved him toward the stables. The boy trudged away, leaving the water still rippling faintly. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the spot. She'd seen that same nervous glance before, though in quite another young man, years ago, when there had been trouble at the vicar's harvest supper. It's never the object, she thought gently, but what people fear it means. A faint knock at her door broke the thread of recollection. It was Dora Weaver, her neighbor from 2 cottages down, clutching a small basket of scones and an air of suppressed excitement. "Morning, Miss Marple. I dare say you've heard about the smoke last night." "Smoke?" said Miss Marple, setting aside her knitting with practiced calm. "No, indeed, Dora. Was there a fire?" Dora lowered her voice, though there was no one else about. "Not exactly a fire, though they say the ashes were still warm come dawn. Behind the hall near the gardener's sheds. Mr. Bartlett says someone was burning papers, and at that hour of night too." He saw the glow through his window. Miss Marple poured the tea with a steady hand, watching how Dora's eyes gleamed in the telling. "Curious," she murmured. "And Mrs. Bantry, did she mention anything?" "Oh, not a word. But between us, she's been so strange lately. Cancelled her bridge party, said the hall's too drafty for guests, and now this business is burning." Dora leaned in. "You don't think it could be that girl again, do you?" "What girl?" "The one from the fete. The one who said she'd lost her employment up at the hall. Violet something. She was crying outside the Green Man last week, saying she'd been wronged." Dora paused, savouring the drama. "They say Mrs. Bantry dismissed her sudden-like after that jewellery went missing." Miss Marple's expression did not change. She stirred her tea slowly. "I should hardly think Mrs. Bantry would let any real impropriety pass unnoticed, Dora. Still curious timing." From the green came the sound of a motor car, incongruously loud in the still morning. Inspector Craddock stepped out, his overcoat flapping, his expression already lined with the knowledge that peace in St. Mary Mead seldom lasted long. He crossed toward Gossington Hall with brisk, purposeful strides. "That will be the official confirmation," Dora whispered, eyes wide. "Of what, my dear? Of something dreadful, surely." The constable came down from the hall just after dawn, said he needed the doctor, and quickly. "Oh, Miss Marple, don't you see? There's trouble up there." Miss Marple's glance returned to the green, where Craddock's figure disappeared through the side gate of the hall. Her mind, orderly as a lace sampler, began to arrange the morning's fragments. A boy in the reeds, ashes behind the sheds, a dismissed servant, a cancelled bridge party. Too many small disturbances for one village morning. "Tea, Dora," she said gently. But Dora could hardly sit still. "I'll go fetch my sister. She'll never forgive me if I don't see what's afoot." When the door had closed and the sound of hurried footsteps faded down the lane, Miss Marple looked again toward the hall. The frost had begun to melt in thin streaks, darkening the grass into the color of old pewter. A rook cawed from the steeple, and the air felt heavier, as if the morning itself were listening. She stood, setting her knitting carefully on the table, and moved to the window. From here she could just make out the faint plume of smoke rising again from behind the halash, falling thin and grey upon the green. Miss Marple's lips pressed together, thoughtful. "Yes," she said softly, "to no one at all. Something has begun." Inspector Craddock's boots left dark prints across the frost-softened path as he passed behind the hall's kitchen garden. The faint tang of smoke still hung in the air, not acrid but oddly sweet, like paper and lavender sachets burned together. Two constables stood near the gardener's shed, their breath clouding faintly, eyes fixed on a sheet-covered shape at the edge of the pond. Mrs. Lorimer was wringing her apron with such force one might have thought she meant to twist the truth out of it. "I told him not to touch anything," she said, her voice wobbling. "But the boy, Petery, said it looked like laundry. It was the sleeve what gave it away." Craddock bent down, lifted the corner of the sheet just enough to see, and replaced it quietly. "Best we let the doctor confirm," he said, though his tone made clear he had no doubt. "How long had the lad been here this morning?" "Since dawn, I suppose," she replied. "But I don't see how he could have known. It's always been so peaceful here, sir." The ducks, quiet like something out of one of their picture books. Miss Marple, who had arrived unnoticed through the side gate thanks to Dora Weaver's excitable chatter being a most effective diversion, stood a little way back. Her expression was mild, as though she'd merely taken a wrong turn during a morning walk. Craddock spotted her at once. "Ah, Miss Marple, you do have a talent for finding trouble, or perhaps it's trouble that finds you. I should rather think it's human nature, Inspector," she said, her eyes resting briefly on the sheeted form. "It does tend to turn up everywhere, rather like bindweed." He gave a grim smile. "Best stay back, ma'am. Nasty business." "Oh, I shall," she murmured. But her gaze had already travelled toward the ground near the pond. The frost was patchy there, melted in uneven circles as though someone had knelt for some time, then risen. The constable nearest her was shifting awkwardly, trying to avoid looking at the water. Miss Marple's soft question caught him off guard. "Tell me, young man, were there many footprints before yours?" He hesitated. "A few, ma'am. But most looked old. Gardeners, maybe. There was one small like a lady's, but they led toward the hall, not away from it." "Interesting," said Miss Marple, as though remarking on a change in the weather. "Footprints tell such truthful stories, until we decide what we wish them to mean." Inside the hall, the air smelled faintly of beeswax and lilies. The Bantrys had always prided themselves on appearances. Mrs. Bantry herself appeared in the doorway, pale but composed, a dressing gown drawn tightly about her. "Inspector, is it true?" she asked, though her voice suggested she already knew. "They told me there's someone by the pond." Craddock inclined his head. "I'm afraid so, ma'am. We'll know more once the doctor arrives." "Dear heavens," she murmured. "Not again. Not here." Her eyes flickered briefly toward Miss Marple, perhaps recalling another grim discovery years ago, when peace at Gossington had been so publicly disturbed. Why must such things come to our doorstep? Miss Marple's answer was quiet, almost kind. "Because doorsteps are such excellent stages, my dear. People forget how many watch them." A clock struck 9:30 somewhere in the house, an elegant, deliberate sound that filled the silence too neatly. Craddock turned to Mrs. Lorimer again. "You mentioned Peter Simmons found the body." "Yes, sir. Said he saw something white near the water. And he was alone." "Well, that is at first light, I suppose so. Though he looked frightened, sir, as if he'd been caught doing wrong." Miss Marple turned her gaze back toward the pond, visible through the window. The ripples had stilled even though the ducks had retreated. What lay beneath that calm, she wondered, was never merely reflection, it was concealment. Outside, the doctor's motor car crunched up the drive. Mrs. Bantry moved to meet him, clinging to the fragile composure of routine. In the hallway's mirror, her reflection trembled, hair unpinned, lips too pale. Miss Marple noted absently the mirror catching what manners hid. Craddock followed the doctor out again, leaving the women in uneasy silence. Miss Marple approached the window, the faintest frown on her lips. "Dora said there were ashes behind the shed," she murmured. Mrs. Lorimer nodded. "That's right. Found 'em at dawn, still smoking. Mr. Bartlett said he'd seen someone burning things." "And you don't know what was burned?" "Couldn't tell. Bits of paper, mostly. No smell of rubbish, more like, well, letters, maybe." Miss Marple folded her hands, her voice gentler than ever. "It's curious how we try to erase what already exists in memory. Fire makes such a poor accomplice." Outside, Craddock's voice carried faintly across the green. A woman, aged perhaps 25, bruising on the neck, likely dead several hours before dawn. Mrs. Lorimer sank onto the chair, eyes wide. "Oh, Lord, preserve us!" And Miss Marple, looking past her reflection into the frost-bright distance, thought not of horror, but of timing the hour, the ashes, and a boy bending by the reeds before the sun rose. Somewhere in that calm symmetry, deceit had found its place. She reached for her shawl, quiet as a prayer. "Mrs. Lorimer," she said softly, "when you spoke of letters, did you happen to see any ink upon the fragments?" The woman blinked. "Ink? No, ma'am." "Why?" "No reason," said Miss Marple, her tone light, though her eyes were shadowed. "Only that sometimes what fails to burn is rather more telling than what does." Outside, the bell of St. Mary's tolled once a long, uneven sound that echoed faintly through the air. And with it came the first whisper of gossip from the lane voices, carrying like smoke, curling, indistinct, and unstoppable. By midday, the air in St. Mary Mead carried a strange expectancy, like a congregation waiting for the vicar to admit a sin that everyone already knew. The story had traveled faster than sense ever could. Someone had been found dead at Gossington Hall, and though no one yet dared to use the word murder, it hung unspoken in every shop and every cup of tea poured too carefully. At the butcher's, Mrs. Price Ridley declared she had always said that sort of thing was bound to happen again. "Ever since that unfortunate affair years back, you mark my words," she told her Q, "that house hasn't had luck. Spirits don't forget." At the same moment, Miss Marple was walking slowly up the lane toward the post office. She moved with her usual measured grace, her mind quietly ordering the village voices. She'd already heard Mrs. Lorimer's trembling account, Dora's bright embellishments, and now the talk at the gate of the Green. Words, she thought, were like seeds once dropped. No one could say what might sprout. Behind the counter, Miss Hartnell looked up from a stack of telegram forms. "Terrible thing, Jane," she said without greeting. "Dr. Haydock's been called to the hall twice already. They say it's a young woman, one of those new servants from London." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, setting a letter on the counter. "Such movement between the towns and the villages. One wonders who anyone is, truly." Miss Hartnell leaned closer, lowering her voice. "They say she was seen arguing with that Simmons boy last night. Outside the public house, no less. And now he's disappeared. His mother's beside herself." "Poor Mrs. Simmons," said Miss Marple softly. "She's had enough trouble with that boy. But perhaps he's only frightened." "Frightened men do foolish things," Miss Hartnell replied with relish. Outside, a group of children were playing marbles near the edge of the green, their laughter oddly shrill against the subdued quiet of the grown-ups. The marbles clicked and scattered bright bits of glass among the grey frost. Miss Marple paused to watch. One marble rolled toward her shoe and came to rest, a perfect sphere of colour in the dull grass. She stooped to pick it up, turning it gently in her palm. "Reflections," she thought. "Even in glass, they tell stories that aren't quite true." A motor car engine cut through the stillness. Inspector Craddock's voice followed, brisk but tired. "Miss Marple, I hoped you hadn't wandered too far." "I rarely wander far from sense, Inspector," she replied, handing the marble to one of the children, who fled as if she'd bestowed a curse. He smiled faintly. "We've taken the body to the doctor's surgery. There'll be an inquest, of course, but, well, there's something I'd like your eyes on." They walked together toward the hall, through the lane now flanked by gossip like hedgerows. Craddock spoke low. "The victim's been identified. My name's Violet Daring, used to work here a few months back. Dismissed after a quarrel with Mrs. Bantry, or so I'm told." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "So Dora's wind was not entirely empty air. She came back last night, apparently. Mrs. Bantry insists she hadn't seen her, but the servants tell a different story. And then there's the business with the ashes, which may or may not have been hers," Miss Marple said. "People burn what they regret, Inspector. But it seldom works." Inside the hall, the grand drawing room was colder than usual, as though even the fire had withdrawn from the day's talk. Mrs. Bantry sat near the hearth, her eyes following every movement of the police photographers. "I can't bear the thought," she whispered as Miss Marple approached. "Poor girl, whatever she'd done, she didn't deserve. Well, this." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her friend's shoulder. "None of us are quite what we deserve, Dolly. That's what makes life so untidy." Craddock gestured to a small tray on the mantelpiece. "We found this in the garden behind the sheds. Bit of jewellery, half melted. Looks like it might have gone into the fire." Mrs. Bantry's breath caught. "That was mine. Or rather it was. A brooch. I thought I'd lost it weeks ago." The inspector frowned. "When exactly?" "After the fete," she said slowly. "The same week Violet left my service." Miss Marple's expression softened, but her eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. A coincidence, perhaps. But coincidences in Gossington tend to have rather determined characters, don't you think? Craddock pocketed the evidence with a grunt. "If that's so, Miss Marple, I'll be questioning everyone in the hall before supper." "I expect you will," she said, "though I've found that questioning rarely yields as much as listening." A faint draught stirred the curtains, carrying the smell of extinguished smoke. Somewhere beyond the house, the church bell struck again once, and then a pause, like a hesitation between thoughts. Miss Marple looked toward the window, where the light was shifting, thin clouds dragging over the sun. The reflection of Mrs. Bantry's silver teapot shimmered there, warping the shapes of those gathered in a roomful of faces, none quite true. She turned back to Craddock quietly. "You see, Inspector, the trouble with respectability is that it often knows how to hide. And when it starts to burn away, what remains can be most revealing. The inspector met her gaze, uneasy but intrigued. "You think this was no crime of passion, then?" "I think," she said, "that passion is rarely as simple as people hope. It dresses itself in better clothes." A silence followed, filled only by the faint ticking of the clock. Outside, the first flakes of new ash-soft, wind-borne from some chimney drifted past the window, grey upon grey. Miss Marple watched them fall, her mind weaving threads invisible to others. She turned slightly, eyes narrowing not at the fire, but at the empty chair near the door, where the cushion bore the faint imprint of someone recently seated. Inspector Craddock followed Miss Marple's gaze toward the empty chair, its cushion still indented as though it held a ghost reluctant to leave. He frowned, about to ask, but the butler, Graves, entered with his usual grave precision. "Inspector," he said, "there's a lady to see you, Mrs. Simmons. She insists it's urgent." Craddock straightened. "Show her in." Mrs. Simmons appeared at the doorway, bonnet askew, eyes swollen from tears. Her hands worked the hem of her coat as though they might wring sense from cloth. "I'm sorry, sir," she said breathlessly, "but I had to come. It's my Peter. He's gone. Left before breakfast. I found his bed cold." Craddock's tone softened, though his eyes did not. "When did you last see him?" "Last night, sir, after he came home from the Green. Said he'd been helping at the hall, but he looked strange. Said he'd seen something he shouldn't." And now her voice broke. "He's just gone." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but she reached for the teacup on the mantel as if to steady the air between them. "Did he say what it was he'd seen, my dear?" Mrs. Simmons shook her head. "Only that it was none of his business and that people were wicked when they pretended to be kind." The sentence hung between them like a draught in the room. Craddock made a note, glancing toward Miss Marple, who seemed more interested in the faint scorch mark on the chair arm than in his pad. "We'll send word to the neighboring villages," he said. "If he's hiding, we'll find him." "I don't think he's hiding, sir," she said miserably. "I think he's running." Graves ushered her to a seat, but she refused the tea offered by Mrs. Bantry. "I just want to know he's not in trouble," she murmured. "Perhaps," said Miss Marple gently. "Trouble is not where he's gone, but what he's left behind." When Mrs. Simmons had been led out, Craddock exhaled. "That boy looks guiltier by the minute." Miss Marple was watching the firelight play over the silver tray on the mantelpiece. Its surface, newly polished, caught the reflection of every movement in the room, distorted, shimmering, untrustworthy. "Appearances, Inspector," she said softly, "are rarely more than polite disguises." He pocketed his notebook. "I prefer evidence that doesn't need polishing." "And yet," she replied, "one often finds the truth only after the polish has worn off." From the doorway, a hesitant voice interrupted. "Excuse me, Sir Doctor. Haydock asked if you might wish to see him before he leaves. He's in the library." Craddock nodded and left, and Miss Marple followed a moment later, as quietly as if she had been summoned by intuition alone. The library at Gossington Hall smelled of old paper and something faintly medicinal. Dr. Haydock stood by the writing desk, his face drawn but composed. "It's a nasty case, Inspector," he said as they entered. "Strangulation, but the bruises are curious, uneven, as if made by hesitation rather than strength." "Hesitation?" Craddock asked. Haydock nodded, as though whoever did it couldn't quite bring themselves to finish it, but finish it they did. Miss Marple's hands rested lightly on the back of a chair. "There's a dreadful distinction, Doctor, between conscience and weakness. They look the same until the deed is done." The doctor glanced at her with wry respect. "You've the soul of a psychologist, Miss Marple. I've often said so. Only the memory of too many garden teas, Doctor. People reveal far more over sponge cake than under oath." Craddock turned back to the desk. Anything else of note? Only this. Haydock gestured to a small paperweight on the blotted, a clear glass dome enclosing a single pressed violet, slightly faded. This was on the girl's person. Odd coincidence, that. Miss Marple's eyes flickered. Violets are rarely coincidental, Doctor. They're a flower for modesty and for remembrance. The doctor pocketed his spectacles. Then perhaps someone wished she was remembered, though not alive. As they left the library, the afternoon light had dimmed to the color of tarnished pewter. Miss Marple paused in the hallway, glancing at a small painting half hid behind the stairwell pastoral scene of Gossington Green under snow. The figures upon it, genteel and indistinct, seemed almost to waver in the fading light, as though uncertain of their own innocence. She turned to Mrs. Bantry, who had reappeared at the top of the stairs. "Dolly, when you dismissed Violet, did she leave at once?" Mrs. Bantry hesitated. "Not at once. She stayed the night with her things in the laundry room. I remember because she asked for a candle, said she didn't like the dark. And the next morning, she was gone. I thought that was the end of it." Miss Marple nodded, her voice tender. Endings are such optimistic things. Craddock's tread on the stair echoed like a closing book. "We'll question the rest of the staff before dusk." Miss Marple gave a slight smile. "Yes, Inspector. I rather think dusk is when truth begins to talk." Outside, as the first lamps of evening flickered on, a gust of wind stirred the ashes near the pond. They scattered briefly, revealing the faint outline of a footprint too small for a man's and too deep for the wind to have made. The wind that had stirred the ashes swept over the green and down the lane toward the vicarage, carrying with it a faint chill that seemed to whisper through the hedges. Miss Marple, walking with her shawl drawn close, felt the cold less than the unease behind it. She had seen enough of human weather to know when a storm was turning inward rather than skyward. Reverend Leonard Clement greeted her at the door with his usual mild perplexity, as though the presence of murder within walking distance required a theological adjustment. "Jane." "My dear, come in. Griselda's making tea. She insists it's the only thing to prevent despair." Griselda, lively as always, appeared from the parlor with a teapot that steamed with moral determination. "I told Leonard," she said, "that if we're to have another scandal in the parish, at least we should host it with proper china." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Tea has often revealed more than confession, my dear. It is difficult to lie gracefully while pouring." They settled around the fire, and the talk turned gently, but inevitably, to Gossington Hall. The vicar sighed. "Poor Mrs. Bantry. She's borne enough gossip for 3 lifetimes. To have tragedy strike again, well, it feels almost theatrical." "Tragedy often repeats itself in polite society," Miss Marple murmured. "People like to rehearse their reputations." Griselda raised a brow. "And what of the boy, Peter Simmons? Everyone says he's fled to London. I can't imagine he planned murder on purpose." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Very few plan it, my dear, but it does have a way of fitting itself into the spaces people make with fear." The vicar nodded gravely. "Inspector Craddock called this morning. He's asked that we encourage calm among the parishioners. I fear calm is not something St. Mary Mead is inclined to provide at present." Griselda poured another cup. "Well, calm doesn't sell at the grocer's, Leonard. But dread keeps the village awake." Outside the window, the afternoon light had softened to the dim gold of late day. The church bell struck 4, its resonance carrying across the roofs toward Gossington Green. Miss Marple's eyes followed the sound as if it traced an invisible path of thought. "I wonder," she said quietly, "if anyone has asked what Violet Deering was doing near the hall again. Dismissed servants seldom return to scenes of humiliation unless summoned or lured." Griselda leaned forward, intrigued. "You think someone asked her back?" "I think," Miss Marple said, setting down her cup, that pride and pity make excellent accomplices. They can invite ruin under the gentlest of pretexts. The vicar frowned. But who, Jane? Surely not Dolly Bantry. Miss Marple gave a small, almost indulgent smile. Oh, I shouldn't think so. Mrs. Bantry's faults are well catalogued, and deceit is not among them, but others in her orbit may value reputation above truth. That's a more dangerous impulse. There was a pause, a small silence where the ticking clock seemed to judge them all. Then Griselda asked, "And what of the letters burned behind the shed?" The constable said there were remnants of handwriting. Miss Marple's knitting bag lay at her feet. She reached for it absently, though her fingers did not move. Letters are curious things, aren't they? We write to unburden and burn to forget, yet both acts betray us equally. The vicar's brows knit. Do you mean they were Violet's letters? Possibly, but not necessarily written by her. Her eyes lifted, sharp with thought. Burning letters is a gesture of conscience, not guilt. The two are seldom the same. A knock interrupted the moment urgent, hesitant. It was Dora Weaver again, breathless from haste. "Miss Marple, they've found something by the pond. Mr. Bartlett says it's a woman's glove, and not one belonging to the dead girl either." Griselda looked from Dora to Miss Marple. "Another woman?" Miss Marple rose, wrapping her shawl neatly, or the shadow of one. Both are equally interesting. The vicar called after her as she made for the door. "Jane, do be careful. You're not Scotland Yard." "No," she said softly, "but human nature does keep rather better hours than they do." The walk back to Gossington Hall was quiet, but for the sound of gravel underfoot and the occasional murmur of distant voices. Near the pond, Inspector Craddock stood with a lantern, its light reflecting off the thin film of water like trembling glass. He held up the glove, found it half buried in the reeds. Silk expensive. Too fine for the servants, too small for Mrs. Bantry. Miss Marple examined it without touching. The fabric was cream, though the wrist bore a faint smear of soot. "Burned," she said softly. "But not in the fire. Someone handled ashes recently." Craddock exhaled. "You mean whoever wore this?" "Might have tended a memory," she interrupted. "Or a hidden one." He studied her, uncertain. "You speak as though you know who it was." "Oh no, Inspector. I only know it was someone who wanted very much to appear unmarked by anything unpleasant." A ripple broke the surface of the pond as a duck stirred in the reeds. The lantern light wavered. Miss Marple's gaze followed the dark water until it stilled again. Beneath that reflection, the ash and frost mingled grey upon grey, as inseparable as guilt and innocence. "Appearances," she murmured, "are the most patient of liars." The lantern's glow lingered on the pond, the water swallowing the light in slow, tremulous gulps. Inspector Craddock lowered it, his brow furrowed as though the reflection itself were an accusation. "We'll have the glove tested," he said, though his tone betrayed no conviction that science would untangle what conscience had already muddled. Miss Marple, her eyes half lidded against the wind, seemed to study not the pond, but the air above it, the way it trembled faintly, like something disturbed, but not yet fled. "Curious, isn't it?" she murmured, "how water keeps its secrets better than people do. Yet both leave ripples." Craddock gave a short, weary laugh. "You speak in riddles, Miss Marple. I deal in evidence." "Then we are both in pursuit of truth," she said gently. "Only yours requires proof, while mine listens for patterns." He looked ready to respond when a shout carried from the hall. One of the constables was waving his torch toward them. "Inspector, you'd best come quick. There's been another discovery inside the hall this time." They hurried back across the green. The house stood stark against the dimming sky, its windows flaring orange from within. In the foyer, Mrs. Bantry hovered near the stairs, pale but composed. "It's in the morning room," she said, clutching the banister as though it might anchor her against gossip's coming tide. The inspector pushed open the door. The room smelled faintly of lilacs and something sharper, burnt dust, perhaps. On the writing desk lay a small, singed envelope, its edges curled inward like petals around a dead bloom. A constable had set it on a tray, unwilling to disturb it further. "Found it in the wastebasket, sir," he said, "hidden under some ashes." Craddock used his pencil to lift the flap. Inside, only one scrap of paper remained, the rest half-charred and illegible. But one word written in a woman's looping hand was still clearly forgiven. He exhaled sharply. "Someone's been burning correspondence again. That makes twice in as many days." Miss Marple approached quietly, her gaze not on the letter but on the desk's surface. The dust there showed two faint half-moon prince fingers, smudged by ash. "The same hand, perhaps," she murmured, "or the same conscience." Mrs. Bantry, standing in the doorway, wrung her hands. "I swear I knew nothing of this. Graves said he cleared the wastebasket only yesterday." "Then it was placed there," Craddock replied. "Miss Marple, you've known this house longer than I. Who here would have access to this room without notice?" She did not answer immediately. Her eyes drifted to the portrait above the mantel. Colonel Bantry, forever frozen in quiet authority, the kind of man whose presence lingered even after death. "Access," she said softly, "is not always about doors, Inspector. Some enter by trust." Graves cleared his throat from the hall. "Beg pardon, sir, but Miss Hartnell from the post office sent a message. She says the Simmons boy's been seen down by the old quarry road." Craddock stiffened. "Alive, then?" "Seems so, sir." "Running?" I looked frightened. "I'll take the car down," the inspector said. "If he knows something, we'll have it before nightfall." He turned to Miss Marple. "You'll forgive me if I ask you to stay clear of the quarry. It's no place for observation." "Observation," she said mildly, "has very little to do with place." He left, his footsteps fading into the cold corridor. Miss Marple remained where she was, her gaze fixed on the small word, "forgive," now dimming under the fading lantern light. She wondered, not for the first time, whether forgiveness ever came before confession or whether it merely disguised what guilt refused to name. Mrs. Bantry broke the silence with a brittle laugh. How absurd it all seemed, letters, gloves, ashes, and yet every detail feels heavy, as if meaning itself were hiding under the dust. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Meaning does hide, Dolly. Usually in the places people clean most often." From outside came the distant growl of the motor car departing toward the quarry. The sound dwindled into the night, leaving the house unnervingly still. Miss Marple walked to the window. The lamps along the green glowed through the mist like watchful eyes. Behind her, Mrs. Bantry sank into a chair. "Jane," she whispered, "what if it was someone or someone we know?" Miss Marple turned, her expression unreadable. "It is always someone we know, my dear. The only question is how well." The fire hissed suddenly, collapsing inward. A small puff of grey rose up, momentarily clouding the room with the scent of burnt paper. Through that haze, Miss Marple noticed something gleaming faintly beneath the edge of the desk, half hidden by the carpet. She bent, lifted it gently. A button. Ivory with a dark streak of soot along one edge. She turned it over in her palm, thoughtful. "How very curious," she murmured, almost to herself. "I do believe this once belonged to a woman's glove." Mrs. Bantry looked up, bewildered. "A match to the one they found?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, slipping it into a handkerchief. "Though sometimes the things that match are the ones that wish not to." Outside, the wind rose again, scattering the last of the ashes from the pond into the air. The fragments drifted upward this time, not down, as though the village itself were exhaling a long-held breath. The last trace of ash had scarcely vanished into the mist when Miss Marple turned from the window, her expression composed, but far away. She slipped the folded handkerchief with the button into her reticule and reached for her shawl. Mrs. Bantry, watching her, caught the movement with an anxious glance. "You're not going after them, surely?" "My dear Dolly," Miss Marple said mildly, "I'm far too old for galloping about in motor cars. But I should like a word with Reverend Clement before supper. He has a way of hearing what others confess by accident." The walk to the vicarage was shorter in darkness, the air smelling faintly of damp earth and soot. Lamps flickered behind curtained windows, tiny, self-contained worlds of innocence or deceit, depending on who sat beside the hearth. Miss Marple knew enough of St. Mary Mead to know they were seldom one without the other. At the vicarage gate, she met Dora Weaver again, her face flushed with a thrill of half-knowledge. "Oh, Miss Marple, they've caught him, Peter Simmons, I mean. Down by the quarry road, just as the inspector said. He didn't run far, after all." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, her tone so even it startled Dora into silence. "And where have they taken him now?" "To the constable's cottage, I think. The inspector's with him." Dora lowered her voice conspiratorially. "They say he had blood on his sleeve." "Do they?" Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. "And who, pray, are they this time?" Dora faltered. "Why, Mrs. Price Ridley, of course. She heard it from the doctor's maid, who saw the boy led in. That makes it true enough, doesn't it?" Miss Marple's eyes crinkled faintly. "My dear, truth is rarely improved by such efficiency." At the vicarage, Reverend Clement was bent over his writing desk, making notes in his parish ledger. He looked up as she entered. "Jane, I was just thinking of you. Griselda's gone to deliver soup to poor Mrs. Simmons. I suppose the whole affair has reached its next act?" "One might say so," she replied, settling into the chair opposite him, "though I doubt the drama will end before intermission." The vicar sighed. "The inspector believes the boy guilty." "Belief," Miss Marple said, "is so very convenient for those who wish to stop thinking." She told him briefly of the letter found in the hall, of the button, and of the glove in the reeds. The vicar listened gravely, his fingers steepled. "You mean to say," he murmured, "that these fragments, the glove, the letter, the ashes, might all belong to the same hand? Or to several, each convinced they act for righteousness," she said softly. "It is a village disease, that one. So many wish to protect appearances that truth dies of polite neglect." The clock chimed 7. Outside, a faint rumble signaled the inspector's return. The vicar rose, peering through the lace curtains. "They're back. He doesn't look triumphant." Indeed, Inspector Craddock appeared in the doorway moments later, mud on his coat and fatigue in his eyes. "We've found him," he said. "But the business isn't simple. The boy swears he didn't kill the girl, claims he found her already dead." Miss Marple tilted her head. That would be quite an advanced reaction for one of his temperament. "Did he say what made him run?" "He said she asked to meet him, Violet Daring did, by the pond. Wanted to make amends, whatever that means. When he got there, she was lying still, half in the water. He panicked and ran." The vicar frowned. Why on earth would she summon him there? Craddock dropped into a chair, rubbing his temples. Apparently she had something to give him. A letter. He says she held it in her hand. But when we arrived, nothing happened. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the firelight. A letter that vanished, and another burned. Such tidy disappearances, Inspector. It almost suggests organization. He gave a dry laugh. You make it sound like a parish committee. "Oh, those," she said with mock gravity, "are far more dangerous." The inspector glanced at her sharply. "You don't think the Bantry servants are mixed up in this?" "I think," she replied carefully, "that servants see what their masters conceal, but the difference between witnessing and understanding is considerable." A knock at the door interrupted them. Griselda returned, cheeks pink from the cold, a folded paper clutched in her glove. "Leonard, look what Mrs. Simmons gave me. Said it was Peter's and found it under his pillow." She thought it might help. Craddock reached for it, but Miss Marple's quiet voice stopped him. "Allow me, Inspector. I promise I won't contaminate the evidence." She unfolded the sheet delicately. It was a torn page from an old exercise book, marked with faint pencil lines, a childish sketch of Gossington Hall. But what drew her attention was the scribble at the corner, a single phrase in clumsy block letters. She said he would forgive me. Craddock leaned closer. Forgive. Again that word. "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, her eyes narrowing. "Forgiveness is such a respectable word, isn't it? One can hide almost anything behind it." The vicar shivered slightly, though the fire still burned. "What do you make of it, Jane?" She folded the paper with care. "That someone has been praying for absolution long before this death occurred." A silence followed, thick and brittle. Outside, the church bell tolled 8, and through the wavering glow of the window, Miss Marple could just see the faint smear of smoke rising once more from the direction of Gossington Hallenu. Deliberate and unrepentant. She rose slowly. "It appears," she said, almost to herself, "that someone has not quite finished burning their conscience." The faint smear of smoke above the hall drew the eye even against the darkening sky. Miss Marple's shawl tightened at her throat as she stepped from the vicarage porch. Behind her, the murmur of voices, Craddock's firm, the vicar's worries, Griselda's indignation faded into the hush of evening. Each step toward the hall felt measured, deliberate, as though she were walking through someone else's memory. The air carried that familiar scent against burnt paper, mingled with damp leaves. It seemed to follow her through the gate, curling about the hedgerows. Lamps glowed faintly through mist, their halos blurred, like secrets pretending to be innocent. At the kitchen entrance, Graves met her with his usual composure, though the tightness about his mouth betrayed fatigue. "Ah, Miss Marple, I thought you might return. Mrs. Bantry insisted you should come directly if she's quite beside herself." "Understandably," Miss Marple said. "Has the inspector returned?" "Not yet, ma'am, but the doctor has, and he's in with her now." Miss Marple moved down the corridor, her steps soft against the flagstones. The smell of wood polish and old roses lingered, the domestic effort of respectability doing battle with unease. In the drawing-room, Mrs. Bantry sat near the fire, her face illuminated by the uneasy glow of the flames. "Jane," she cried as Miss Marple entered. "Oh, I'm so glad you've come. It's happening again, first the body, now this nonsense with the smoke. Graves says someone's been in the storage room again, the old one at the back where Arthur used to keep his hunting ledgers." Miss Marple's eyes moved to the hearth. A small pile of grey flakes rested there, no larger than a teacup saucer. The pattern was too neat to be accidental. "Did you see who went in?" she asked quietly. "No, but Graves found the door unlatched and a candle stub burned to the wick. The whole place smells of signed paper." Mrs. Bantry's voice trembled. It's as though the house itself were trying to erase something. Miss Marple took a seat, folding her hands over her reticule. "Fire does that very convincingly," she murmured, "though it leaves the scent of guilt long, after the evidence is gone." Dr. Haydock emerged from the adjoining room, wiping his spectacles. He gave Miss Marple a courteous nod. "Evening, Jane. You'll find your friend here a touch overwrought, but I can't deny someone's mischief. There's ink residue near the ashes in that storeroom, as if ledgers or letters were destroyed recently." "Ledgers," Miss Marple echoed. "How dull a thing to risk scandal for. Unless dullness was the disguise." Haydock frowned slightly. "Meaning? Meaning that respectable records often conceal the unrespectable truth." Her gaze rested on the fire again, thoughtful, particularly when money or sentiment is involved. Graves re-entered with a tray, his movements precise but distracted. As he poured the tea, a small slip of something fluttered from his sleeve, a corner of paper singed along the edge. Miss Marple's glance caught it before he did. "Oh, Graves," she said softly, "you seem to have brought a souvenir from the storeroom." The butler froze. "I beg your pardon, ma'am." She gestured delicately. "Your cuff." He looked down, mortified, and quickly brushed the fragment away. "Apologies, ma'am. The air in there must have caught it. I was merely looking at the latch after the doctor left." "Of course," said Miss Marple, her tone as gentle as if she'd commented on a misplaced napkin. Yet her eyes followed him with mild curiosity as he departed. Mrs. Bantry clutched her cup with unsteady hands. "Jane, you don't think surely not Graves?" "My dear, I never think surely not of anyone," Miss Marple said. "That phrase has excused more wickedness than confession ever has." The doctor, half amused, half uneasy, added, "If you're right, Jane, you'll be putting the whole parish in the dock." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, but it's been there for years, Doctor. We merely pretend the pews are comfortable." A knock interrupted them. Graves returned, paler than before. "Inspector Craddock, ma'am." Craddock entered, dust on his coat and a fatigue that no lamp could soften. "The boy's still at the station. We'll keep him overnight." "But there's something odd, Miss Marple. He insists Violet wasn't alone that night. Says he saw a second lantern by the pond, someone standing behind the ash tree, a woman in a dark coat." Mrs. Bantry gasped. "A woman? But who?" Miss Marple's eyes met the inspector's. "The glove," she said quietly. Craddock nodded grimly. "We'll be questioning everyone in the morning. I'll need to see that button you found." "It's quite safe," she replied, "and perhaps more revealing than it looks." He gave her a puzzled glance, but Miss Marple's attention had already turned toward the window. The curtains swayed faintly, though the latch was closed. Beyond the glass, the fog pressed closer, luminous with the glow of the lamps. Mrs. Bantry followed her gaze nervously. "What is it, Jane?" Miss Marple's voice was low, thoughtful. "Fog hides things well enough, but it also has a way of drifting where it shouldn't under doors. Between rooms, a most democratic sort of concealment." She rose, tightening her shawl. "Inspector, may I trouble you for one more small favor? Tomorrow, before you question the servants, might you see that no one lights the fires?" "No fires?" Craddock frowned. "Why on earth not?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, almost kind. "Because sometimes the most innocent flame tells the ugliest tale if one watches what the smoke clings to." Outside, the wind shifted, pressing the fog against the window pane until it trembled, as though the village itself were listening. The fog pressed harder against the windows, its pale weight turning the drawing-room's lamplight into a muted amber. Miss Marple stood motionless a moment longer, her gaze fixed upon the trembling pane. Then, with the faintest sigh, she turned back toward the hearth. "You see, Inspector," she said softly, "the smoke is rather like a memory. It never rises where it is told, it drifts where it is drawn." Craddock, tired and irritated by the hour, gave a small huff. "With respect, Miss Marple, smoke doesn't solve murders." "No," she replied mildly, "but it tells one where warmth has been." He had no answer for that, and instead motioned for the constable to secure the hall for the night. The clatter of boots retreated down the corridor. Only the fire crackled, and Mrs. Bantry, white and wan, murmured something about taking a sedative. Miss Marple touched her hand with gentle firmness. "Sleep, Dolly. You'll need a clear conscience to survive the morning papers." When the door closed behind her, Miss Marple drew the curtains fully and faced the inspector. "You should post a watch outside, not at the gates. Whoever's setting these little fires doesn't come from without. They come from within." He nodded reluctantly. "You think it's someone in the house?" "I think it's someone accustomed to being believed." she said. And belief, Inspector, is the perfect disguise for deceit. Craddock made a note and left her to the quiet. The minute the last footstep vanished, Miss Marple moved closer to the fire. Her fingers hovered near the ashes. The half-burnt flakes, grey and soft, carried tiny veins of black ink. She brushed one gently aside with the poker. Beneath the grate, lodged against the iron, lay something small and metallic. She reached for her handkerchief and plucked it out delicately. A clasp, oval, with a hinge bent slightly askew. Once it might have held a locket or perhaps a miniature portrait. The soot had blackened its surface, but when she turned it toward the light, faint letters gleamed along the inner rim, F.D. Miss Marple's expression did not change. She folded the clasp into her handkerchief, as if it were nothing more than a dropped button, and rose to her feet. The fire hissed behind her, resentful of discovery. She made her way through the corridor, each step muffled by the thick carpet. From the direction of the servants' wing came faint laughter, forced, brittle. People laugh that way, she thought, when fear has made them suddenly polite. Graves emerged from the shadows, his manner composed as always. "Still awake, ma'am? Might I fetch you some tea before you retire?" "That's very kind," she said, her tone light. "I find a warm cup helps me think, though not always in the direction people expect." He bowed slightly, uncertain whether he'd been complimented or warned, and departed toward the kitchen. Miss Marple paused by the tall case clock in the hall, its pendulum glinting faintly. 11:30. Too late for propriety, too early for truth. The air smelled faintly of beeswax and ash. She opened the front door and a crack in the fog rolled in, cool and dense, touching her cheek like a damp breath. Across the green, faint shapes moved, constables on patrol, perhaps, and beyond them a single lantern bobbed near the vicarage gate. Not the police. The rhythm was too slow, the motion too deliberate. She closed the door softly and returned to the drawing room just as Graves reappeared with the tea. His tray rattled once before he steadied it. "The kettle was nearly cold," he said. "I had to light a bit of paper to coax it back." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the faint smudge of soot at his cuff. "How resourceful," she said pleasantly, "though you might find that lighting paper these days is rather frowned upon." His glance darted briefly to hers, then away. "Yes, ma'am, quite so." When he left again, the faint clink of the teacup seemed oddly loud. Miss Marple set it aside untouched. The house had begun to settle, its silence alive with small sounds, the ticking clock, the settling beams, the occasional creak of old wood remembering footsteps. She moved toward the writing desk, where the signed envelope still rested on its tray. Lifting the corner, she examined the handwriting anew. Feminine, elegant, but hesitant, each loop slightly tremulous. The word "forgive" had been written twice, the first scratched out almost angrily. A sudden rap at the window startled her. Craddock's face appeared in the fog, pale and impatient. She unlatched the sash, and the cold poured in. "Sorry to disturb," he said, lowering his voice. The watchman spotted light behind the hall again up near the gardener's cottages. "Thought you should know." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Another fire, then. Or perhaps just someone hoping we'll think so." Craddock's frown deepened. "You're suggesting a diversion." "I'm suggesting," she said, "that while we watch for flames, something far more delicate smolders elsewhere." He looked at her as though to press further, but she had already drawn the curtains. "Good night, Inspector," she said, her voice almost tender. "You'll need your rest. Tomorrow will be a long day for all of us." When the window closed, Miss Marple returned to the hearth, where the embers glowed faintly under, a skin of grey. She stirred them once, and from beneath the charred logs rose a thin plume of smoke curling upward, steady, almost purposeful. She watched it twist, her face unreadable. "Smoke," she whispered to herself, "never lies. But it does choose whom to tell." The tendril of smoke faded into the rafters, its trail dissolving as though it had never been. Miss Marple's eyes followed it until the last wisp vanished, leaving only the dull red pulse of the embers. A clock chimed midnight. In Gossington Hall, every sound seemed exaggerated by the hour, the whisper of the drapes, the faint settling of the walls, the rustle of unease that had replaced sleep. She rose, adjusting her shawl, and crossed to the window once more. The fog outside had thickened to an almost solid veil, swallowing the green, the cottages, even the church spire beyond. Only the lantern by the gate remained visible, a soft yellow smudge floating in darkness. The village, she thought, looked as if it were holding its breath. A movement caught her eye. The curtain opposite the door stirred slightly. Not from a draught, this was slower, deliberate. She turned her head just as the handle clicked. Graves stood there, framed by the light of the corridor, his face composed but his voice unusually strained. "I beg your pardon, ma'am. I didn't realize you were still awake." "Few people realize, Mr. Graves," she said quietly. "That's why so much happens after bedtime." He gave a polite nod, but his gaze did not meet hers. "I came to see that all was secure. Mrs. Bantry has retired, and the inspector will return at dawn." "Then I am reassured," said Miss Marple. "Though perhaps not entirely." He hesitated, then drew back the curtain she had been watching. "Only the drought, I assure you." The fog pressed against the glass, like breath upon a mirror. For a moment, it seemed to take shape something almost human outlined by lamplight before dissolving again. Graves' hand trembled on the curtain cord, and Miss Marple, observing him as she might a skittish bird, noticed the faint sheen of sweat on his temple. "You've served the Bantrys for many years, haven't you?" she asked conversationally. 14, ma'am." "Nearly 15. "And yet," she said, "you look as though you've only now begun to wonder whether loyalty and truth are the same thing." The butler flinched almost imperceptibly. "I do my duty, Miss Marple." "Yes," she said softly. "And that's the difficulty, isn't it? Duty to whom?" He opened his mouth, closed it again, and bowed stiffly. "Good night, ma'am." When he was gone, she remained motionless, her gaze lingering on the heavy drapes. Behind them, the faintest outline handprint perhaps had left a darker mark upon the fabric, invisible except in the slant of lamplight. She touched it lightly with one gloved finger. The cloth was still warm. The night passed uneasily. She did not sleep, though she sat for a time in the chair by the fire, her knitting resting idle in her lap. The pattern she had begun, an intricate lace of ash-gray wool, looked suddenly untidy, as though it too had lost its symmetry. At dawn, the fog broke into fine mist. The green re-emerged like a painting slowly washed with light. From the direction of the vicarage came the sound of a milk cart and the clatter of a gate. Miss Marple stood, smoothed her skirt, and prepared herself for the day's civility. Inspector Craddock arrived shortly after 7, brisk despite the sleepless night. "Morning, Miss Marple. You'll be glad to hear we've found something. A small packet buried near the gardener's shed, tied in oilcloth. Letters, from what I can tell." Her eyes brightened, though her voice remained calm. "Letters are stubborn things, Inspector. They have a way of surviving the fires meant to destroy them." He frowned. "We'll know soon enough what they say. But I don't understand if these letters mattered so much. Why bury them at all?" "To delay discovery," she said, "and to allow just enough time for someone to look innocent." Craddock studied her. "You're thinking of Graves?" "I'm thinking of anyone who believes reputation can be saved with a match," she said gently. "That could include more than one person under this roof." Before he could reply, the door opened and Mrs. Bantry entered, her hair hastily pinned, her complexion pale with distress. "Inspector, Miss Marple, there's something you must see." "In the storeroom again." They followed her down the corridor to the back of the house. The door hung open. Inside, the ashes had been disturbed, scattered across the floor like grey snow. A single object lay at the center of a photograph frame, cracked and blackened. The image within had been half burned, but one detail remained clear: the corner of a young woman's face and, beside it, the unmistakable edge of a man's uniform collar. Mrs. Bantry gasped. "That's Arthur's regiment, but the woman isn't me." Craddock lifted the frame carefully. Whoever tried to burn this didn't finish the job. Miss Marple's voice, when it came, was soft but steady. People rarely do when emotion outpaces intention. The inspector turned toward her. "Meaning?" "Meaning," she said, her gaze fixed on the charred image, "that this death has been years in the making, Inspector. The kind that smolders quietly beneath the surface until someone remembers to breathe." A draught stirred the ashes on the floor, lifting them briefly into the light. For an instant, they hung suspended, forming the faint outline of two figures, one blurred, one clear, before collapsing again into dust. Miss Marple watched the fragments settle with something almost like pity. Then, very quietly, she said, "I do believe, Inspector, that the dead are not the only ones being hidden here." The ashes fluttered once more before settling to stillness, as if the air itself had exhaled a long-kept secret. Miss Marple's eyes remained on them, pale and thoughtful, until the silence in the storeroom felt almost reverent. Then she looked up first at Mrs. Bantry, trembling by the door, and then at Inspector Craddock, whose patience had thinned into sharp lines around his mouth. "Whoever placed this photograph here," Miss Marple said, "intended us to see what remains and to imagine what's missing." Craddock's reply was low. "You think it was staged?" "I think it was curated," she corrected gently. "A little theatrical, perhaps, but quite effective. Someone is shaping the story for us, Inspector. They're choosing what we're meant to pity and what we're meant to forget." He drew a slow breath, nodding toward the photograph. "Then tell me, Miss Marple, what are we meant to remember?" "The woman's face, of course," she murmured, "but more importantly, the effort taken to conceal it. That, I find, is often the truer confession." Mrs. Bantry steadied herself against the door frame. "Jane, do you suppose this poor girl Violet knew about it? That photograph must have been years old." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "I rather think she did. Perhaps she thought the past would grant her kindness. It seldom does." A knock at the corridor interrupted them. Graves stood there again, impassive yet pale. "Inspector, a messenger from the station, says the letters have been examined." Craddock followed him out, leaving Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry alone in the lingering scent of scorched paper. The older woman sank into a chair. "Jane, I feel as though the walls themselves have eyes. Every time one looks away, something else appears, letters, buttons, pictures. It's dreadful." Miss Marple rested a hand over hers, her touch light but grounding. "Yes, dear, but dreadful things are often born of small, well-intentioned lies. That's why they thrive so comfortably among us." Through the open doorway, the early morning light crept across the floorboards, illuminating the scattered fragments on the ground. Among them lay a single corner of the photograph that had broken loose from the frame. Miss Marple bent to pick it up. A faint inscription, half-burned, was visible on the back. "To F.D. in gratitude for courage." She folded it into her handkerchief, her expression unreadable. Downstairs, Craddock was speaking with a young constable who held a brown envelope clumsily in his hands. "Found buried shallow," the boy explained. "Letters all addressed to Miss Violet Daring. Most written by the same hand ink matches the burned scraps at the hall." "Who sent them?" asked Craddock. "Can't say, sir. The name's smudged on everyone, like someone wiped it clean before sealing them." Miss Marple's voice drifted from behind them. "Ink blots are such revealing little accidents, don't you think, Inspector? One can learn a great deal from what a hand hesitates to write." Craddock turned. "You think the sender erased their own name?" "Oh, no," she said. "I think someone else did afterwards." To make certain that Violet remained the only guilty party, he frowned. Guilty of what? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Of being inconvenient. By late morning, the hall was alive with subdued commotion. Constables moved through the corridors, the servants were questioned yet again, and the village air filled with rumors so dense one could hardly walk through them. Miss Marple sat quietly at the edge of it all, knitting something so delicate it could have been lace made from fog. Craddock approached her after the final interview, weary but intrigued. The letters all read the same apologies, regrets, talk of debts and favors owed. But none makes sense out of context. That, Miss Marple said, is precisely why they matter. Words divorced from their setting are like people out of place. They reveal far too much. He looked unconvinced. And what of the butler? Graves seems nervous enough to hang himself. "Yes," she murmured, "but nervousness is a peculiar thing. It belongs equally to the guilty and the good-hearted." Craddock sighed. "You make it sound like everyone here could have done it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with that quiet irony peculiar to her. "Well, Inspector, in St. Mary Mead, everyone could have. It's only a matter of who did so for the most human reason." At noon, a carriage arrived from the police station carrying the results of the examination. Craddock unfolded the report and read aloud in clipped tones. 2 sets of handwriting in the letters. The first consistent female, possibly educated. The second, marginal notes and additions, mere uncertain age. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. So not a solitary correspondence, but a conversation disguised as one. Between whom? That, she said, depends on who believed they were being forgiven. She rose then, moving toward the window where sunlight had begun to break through the fog. The green outside was bright again, though oddly barren without its veil. A pair of children walked across it, their laughter faint. Life returning, she thought, but never quite the same shape. Mrs. Bantry entered just as Craddock was about to speak. "Inspector, it's Mr. Graves again asked if he may resign his post. Says he'll leave quietly." Craddock's jaw tightened. "That's a bit premature." Miss Marple's tone was mild. "Sometimes, Inspector, the guilty flee to save the innocent embarrassment, and sometimes the innocent flee to save the guilty from confession. I wonder which Mr. Graves believes himself to be." Craddock rubbed his temples. "You do like to make my job impossible, Miss Marple." "Oh, not at all," she said cheerfully. "I simply make it accurate. When Graves was brought into the study, he looked 10 years older." "I can't remain here, sir," he said to Craddock. "This business with Miss Derringett's brought up things best left buried. Colonel Bantry, he wasn't the man people thought." Mrs. Bantry stiffened. "You'll not speak ill of him in this house." Graves' composure cracked and his voice trembled. "No, ma'am, but the truth doesn't fade because we shut the door on it. He promised the girl Violet help, then forgot her, as men of standing do. She came back for her due." Craddock's face hardened. "And you? Did you help her?" "I tried," he said miserably. "She came to me that night asking if Mrs. Bantry knew. I told her to leave. I burned the letters afterward. I thought it would end there." His eyes flickered toward Miss Marple. "I didn't kill her, I swear it." Miss Marple's expression was serene, though her knitting still had. "No," she said softly. "I dare say you didn't. But you helped bury the truth, Mr. Graves, and the truth, I fear, doesn't stay buried. It smoulders." The butler bowed his head. "Then let it burn, ma'am." Outside, the church bell began to toll the hour. Its sound rolled through the hall like a slow heartbeat. Craddock closed his notebook without comment. Mrs. Bantry wept quietly into her handkerchief. Not for Violet, but for something far less tangible, the erosion of what she had believed her life to be. Miss Marple watched the sunlight shift across the ash-strewn floor, the brightness catching the faint silver thread of her abandoned knitting. "Respectability," she murmured to herself, "is such fragile embroidery. One loose stitch and all the pattern shows." Craddock glanced toward her, uncertain whether she spoke to him or to the empty room. But she was already walking away, her step measured, her gaze calm, the movement of someone who knew the final pattern long before anyone else could see it. The bell's echo lingered in the air long after its final strike, merging with the faint creak of the old timbers. Miss Marple's footsteps carried her into the hallway, where the morning light fractured through the leaded panes, scattering pale shards across the floor. It was that hour between certainty and confession, when even the guilty could still hope to seem misunderstood. Inspector Craddock caught up with her by the window. "You're leaving, Miss Marple. I thought you'd want to see how this ends." She smiled, her expression mild but knowing. "My dear Inspector, it never quite ends. It merely changes its shape. But yes, perhaps I shall see how this version concludes." She paused, glancing toward the garden beyond. "The smoke, you see, is no longer rising. That usually means someone has finally decided they've burned enough." Craddock gave a weary smile. "You speak in riddles again. But I take it you believe Graves didn't act alone." "I believe," she said, "that truth rarely does anything alone." They returned together to the drawing room. The servants had gathered awkwardly in the corridor, faces taut with curiosity and fear. Mrs. Bantry sat upright, her composure restored, though her hands twisted the edge of her handkerchief like a rosary. Graves stood near the fireplace, pale and exhausted, his resignation now folded neatly beside the teapot. Craddock cleared his throat. "We'll take your statement in full at the station, Mr. Graves. For now, I must ask, did anyone else know about those letters before Miss Daring's death?" Graves hesitated. "One person, sir. Mrs. Lorimer. She came upon me burning the first of them. I swore her to silence." Mrs. Bantry's lips parted. "Lorimer, my own housekeeper. She said it wasn't her place to interfere," Graves murmured. "But I think she told someone or someone who understood what the letters meant." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once, twice, then stilled. "Ah," she said softly, "the domino effect of decency. One person tries to protect another, and soon everyone is protecting the wrong one entirely." Craddock frowned. "And you think that second someone had more to lose than either of them?" she finished. "Tell me, Inspector, have you noticed how rarely guilt looks surprised?" His answer was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Lorimer herself, ushered in by a constable. Her face, usually severe, looked drawn and oddly fragile. "You've no call to drag me in front of everyone," she said, though her voice trembled. "I've done nothing but serve faithfully." Miss Marple regarded her gently. "Indeed you have, Mrs. Lorimer. Faithfully to Mrs. Bantry, and perhaps even more faithfully to her memory of the Colonel." The woman's chin lifted, indignant. "He was a good man." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and that is precisely what made his errors so intolerable to you. You couldn't bear to see him imperfect, so you tried to make the imperfection disappear." Mrs. Lorimer's breath caught, the color draining from her face. "I only wanted to save his name." "The girl was going to write that she had proof," she said. "She came that night demanding money, saying she'd been wronged. I told her she'd ruin everything." "And when she wouldn't be silenced?" asked Craddock, his tone measured. The woman's eyes glistened. "I tried to reason with her. She pushed past me, shouting. I swear I didn't mean she stumbled. There was water and darkness. I only wanted to stop her leaving. Afterwards, I thought no one would believe it was an accident." Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost kind. "So you burned the letters?" "Yes," Mrs. Lorimer whispered. "And then the photograph. When I realized it showed them together, I couldn't let Mrs. Bantry see it. I thought it was mercy. The silence that followed was not judgmental, but heavy with the dull ache of inevitability. Mrs. Bantry's eyes closed, her hand pressing against her heart. Craddock signaled the constable, his expression unreadable. "Take her to the car." As the door closed behind them, Mrs. Bantry exhaled a long, shuddering breath. Jane, what a ghastly thing to find loyalty so misplaced. Miss Marple moved closer, her tone as soft as the fading light. "My dear, misplaced loyalty is the foundation of most tragedies. The rest is usually pride." She looked toward the hearth, where the last of the ashes had cooled into a delicate grey crust. It was kindness, you see, that killed her. The wrong kind, the sort that forgets truth in the name of protection. Craddock stepped forward, rubbing the back of his neck. "You knew it was her all along, didn't you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One learns to recognize guilt that hides beneath duty. It has a particular stillness, like a room too well dusted." He shook his head in quiet admiration. "And here I thought I'd learn to read people." "Oh, you will, Inspector," she said. "But it takes time. Understanding human nature is like knitting. One dropped stitch can unravel the whole design, and yet, with patience, it can always be mended." They walked together toward the doorway. The morning sun was filtering through again, revealing the fine dust motes drifting in the air like suspended secrets. Outside, the green gleamed damp and fresh, washed clean by mist. Mrs. Bantry lingered at the threshold, her voice unsteady but composed. "Will the village ever stop talking, Jane?" Miss Marple smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening with fond irony. "No, my dear. Villages never stop talking, but they do forget eventually. And by the time they do, someone else will have provided a newer, more respectable scandal." She turned toward the green, where the first parishioners were already walking to church, heads inclined in murmured speculation. Life, it seemed, was quick to reclaim its rhythm. Craddock, watching her, said quietly, "You always make it sound so simple." "It is simple," Miss Marple replied, "but it's never easy." They parted at the gate, his boots crunching across the gravel, her steps light along the path lined with frost-tipped grass. The village clock struck the half-hour, the sound echoing through the air like the slow closing of a book. Miss Marple paused by the pond, its surface now smooth and undisturbed. A few stray feathers drifted along the edge, remnants of the restless ducks that had scattered the morning of the discovery. She gazed down, her reflection blurred by a faint ripple. "Ashes to ashes," she murmured. "And yet, how much of us still lingers in the smoke?" A breeze stirred the reeds, carrying away the faint scent of burnt paper that had haunted the village for days. The fog was gone, the sunlight clean again, but St. Mary Mead, for all its neatness, would remember. Miss Marple turned away from the pond, her shawl catching the light, her thoughts already elsewhere on tea, on gossip, on the fragile moral balance that made ordinary life both tolerable and treacherous.